Hi, folks. I'm starting a new broadcast on Fiscal Myths, continued, because I had a power glitch. And so the earlier broadcast is now gone. I know there's no warning for this one, so it may be a little while until people actually show up for it. But when you do, I'll be here, and then we can do something. I think. I hope. Hi, Karen. How are you? Hi, Patricia. Yes, I am back. Thank you. Hi, Jim. Yeah, I'm back. Okay, I don't know whether you prefer Jim or James. Okay, but you can let me know that. Hi, Arino. How are you? Hi, Russell. Yeah, we're back. I kept at it. There was a power glitch. I kept at it and I got it back. So no thanks to power glitch. We have fallen just a little behind. Well, of course, I didn't like the power glitch, Karen, but other than that, I'm fine. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, you're back. Dang, I don't think it was a thunderstorm in this case. It was just a very unexplainable power glitch, but I don't believe it's going to happen again. So anyway, please excuse the power glitch, and now we will get on it. So we were at the point we were discussing that the government can only raise money to spend by taxing or borrowing, and how fallacious that was. And the reason why it's fallacious is because it's the Congress that funds and the Federal Reserve that marks up the Treasury account when Treasury needs money to spend. Okay. Also, if one for some reason cannot accept the fact of the matter that the Federal Reserve does simply mark up the Treasury account with the reserves it needs to spend, then one should also consider that there is a law passed in 1996 which allows the Secretary of the Treasury to mint very high value 1 ounce platinum coins in the trillions of dollars, that it is able to have the mint create. The Secretary of Treasury can specify the denomination or face value of the coin. He can order it brought up to the New York Fed for deposit in the Treasury spending account. Not in the Treasury spending account, but in the Mint's public enterprise fund account, which can later be swept into the Treasury spending account by the Treasury Department. And that, in that case, in return for that high value platinum coin, the Federal Reserve will be mandated to credit the Treasury spending account with the reserves it needs to spend. So yes, if you don't want to believe that the Federal Reserve just uses keystrokes to mark up the Treasury spending account, then it's also true that if the Treasury mints a coin and deposits it in the public enterprise fund account and then sweeps the seigniorage from that account into the Treasury spending account, that the Federal Reserve will again be obligated to keystroke the money involved, or to keystroke the creation of new reserves in the Treasury spending account in return for the coin, which it keeps in its vault basically forever. Okay, it shows up on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve as an asset of the Federal Reserve Bank that creates the reserves for the Treasury. So those are two reasons, two concrete reasons why it's wrong to believe that the Treasury can only use taxing or borrowing to fill its account. No, the truth is its account is always filled. Its reserve accounts, its spending account is always filled by the Treasury, by the Federal Reserve doing keystroking. That's the truth of the matter. There's no other way those reserves to spend actually get there. But of course, if Treasury is to spend the reserves, it's got to have the congressional appropriations. The actual funding act has to have taken place. All right. So going a little further now, the next myth is that Social Security and Medicare are running out of money. Well, yes, there are accounts, not bank accounts. There are accounts at the Treasury Department that the department keeps track of concerning the amount of money that has been credited to the Social Security program and to the Medicare program and to other programs that have trust funds, so-called trust funds. But those trust funds do not represent actual bank accounts. They are only records at the Treasury of what the Treasury Department must spend in the future on these particular programs. Now, if any more is to be spent on these programs, then that has to result, as it has always had to result, if you go back far enough, from congressional funding for these programs. So it's not that Social Security and Medicare are running out of money, which the government is somehow short of, or has to be short of. It's just that Congress hasn't guaranteed, has not appropriated the funds for the Social Security and Medicare program. It has not passed an automatic rule, hasn't passed any legislation that makes it automatic that those programs are funded each year. That would take a few lines in its appropriations legislation to do. And then year after year, it would automatically be funded by appropriations. How do we know this is true? Because that's the way Medicare Part D is funded. And nobody says that the Medicare Part D program, which was passed by the Bush administration, that particular program is running out of money. Why don't they say that? They don't say that because Congress has guaranteed that it will automatically receive the funds that it needs year after year after year. It only requires a few lines for Congress to write that in to Social Security legislation or to Medicare legislation or to some of the other trust funds that don't have an automatic sort of guarantee. So let's get Congress to do it. All we have to do is get Congress to do it. It's not a big deal. Okay? So the Social Security and Medicare running out of money problem is another fairy tale. Okay, it's another myth. These programs are not running out of money because the government lacks the capacity to fund them. It's because Congress has not written in this little automatic funding clause. That's it. You got to know that. And you got to point that out to people. And you got to point out the contrast with the Medicare Part D funding. And ask the question, why aren't these other, even more essential programs funded in the same way the Medicare Part D program is funded by Congress? And what the hell is wrong with Congress? You got to start asking those kinds of questions. And when people say that Social Security and Medicare are running out of money and can't get enough funds to pay full benefits without taxing or borrowing, that's not true. It's not true because the first thing that has to be done is for Congress to write in the automatic funding provision. And then the Treasury Department would have to find the funds so that the Federal Reserve could mark up its spending account. And those funds don't in any way have to be connected, and in fact are not actually physically connected to taxing or borrowing, but only connected to to rules in the Federal Reserve that say when and where it can mark up the Treasury accounts. It can keystroke the reserves into the Treasury accounts. That's the only thing holding that back. And the capacity is already there, once again, for the Treasury Department to make sure that the funds are already in the Treasury spending account to fund anything that Congress might automatically fund or appropriate. All the Treasury Department has to do, is each year it needs to mint a platinum coin covering any possible shortfall in Social Security funding for that year, any possible shortfall, in Medicare funding for that year. All it's got to do is print one platinum coin to cover both, plus all the other trust funds that happen to be short for that year. So these projections that these programs are going to fall short, of funding, and they're going to be buried by this mountain of debt. These projections are faux projections. They're not laws of nature. They're the product of certain assumptions in the projections. The basic assumption is that there'll be no change in the funding laws. Well, that's true. But when millions of people descend on Washington, absolutely demanding that Congress put in this little automatic clause into the funding bills for Medicare and Social Security, then Congress is going to change its mind. It's going to change the law. But people have to know. They have to know that that's all that's necessary. And people have to know that Congress already does that each year for Bush's Medicare Part D program. I guess they must have had a special fondness for that program that they don't have for the rest of Social Security and Medicare and for other trust funds. So as I said, what's wrong with Congress? What's wrong with these people? Okay, so here's another austerity move. We need to cut government spending and make do with no more money. Why do we need to do that? They say we need to do that because they say we're running out of money. But for reasons already mentioned, we're not running out of money. That's ridiculous. That's silly. Okay. They also say our government spends more than it takes in. And then they say, that is not sustainable. That is just not sustainable. Our government can't go on spending more than it takes in. Just like you can't go on spending more than you take in, the government can't go on spending more than you take in. Well, that might apply to you, but you're not the issuer of the currency. You're not the creator of the reserves. You're not the minter of high-value platinum coins or even low-value copper coins or low-value silver coins. You can't make your own high-powered money, but the government can, in all the quantities it needs to fulfill its obligations. So, the government spending more than it takes in is completely sustainable for as long as Congress chooses to pass legislation such that the government must spend more than it takes in. It's entirely sustainable. Now, having the real resources to spend on, that may be unsustainable. If we don't do something about the climate, then that's going to be an unsustainable situation. If we don't do something about our technical skills in our population by providing free quality education to everyone, that's going to be unsustainable. If we continue to allow the middle class to decline and to shrink, guess what? Our democracy is going to be unsustainable. In fact, the way it is now, it's already unsustainable. The more inequality we allow to develop, the greater the unsustainability of our democracy becomes, until it's only a shadow of its former self. Those are the kinds of things that are unsustainable. Government funding is not unsustainable because the government ain't running out of money. And that's the truth. They can only run out of money voluntarily. As long as the Constitution says it can create that money, as long as there's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the government can't run out of money. So, watch out for this proposal to have a new constitutional convention. Because if you don't watch out, the idiots who are creating this convention might well go to it and repeal Article 1, Section 8. And then we will be in a fix, a terrible fix. They might repeal that, and they might say, Congress doesn't have the right to create any money at all. It's all about gold. Congress can only tax and borrow. Then you want to see catastrophe? You want to see disaster come to the United States? Hold on to your seats. So, don't let them do a general constitutional convention. That's awful dangerous. Because there are a lot of these gold nuts sitting on packs of gold who are running around. And they want to get rid of our fiat money. Okay. So more myths. More myths. Okay. The federal government has a deficit debt problem which must be addressed through deficit reduction. You hear that all the time. Everybody says the government has a deficit debt problem. It can't be addressed except through reducing deficits. We got to reduce deficits. How many times did Obama say that? How many times does Paul Ryan say it? How many times did the Petersons say it? How many times do all these people say it? You're our progressive army out there. You are our growing army. When they say that, you've got to call them out. We need to have deficits of sufficient size that they compensate for the leakage of net financial assets to the foreign sector and to savers in our economy. Unless we have deficits that are larger than that, actually at least as large as those two things, but at least as large as the trade deficit, and if we want to have good times, as large as the leakage of net assets to savers, then we have to have deficits that large, or our economy isn't going to grow. It's going to shrink. And eventually, when we're through with the credit bubbles that the Federal Reserve is going to blow to compensate for that, we're going to have another crash. So, they also say our deficit hawks, our deficit mongers, our Austerians, our fiscal mythologists, they also say if the government borrows more money, then the bond markets will increase the government's interest rates, driving up the cost of government debt. Okay, well, let me tell you something. Yes, Russell, G minus T equals S minus I plus X minus M. Hooray. Okay. So, do you see the private debt markets driving up the cost of government debt right now? I don't see that happening. I saw the Federal Reserve for years and years and years keeping those interest rates down close to zero. And now I'm seeing the Federal Reserve, an agency of the government, raising those interest rates. It's not the private bond markets raising those interest rates. That's another myth. The private bond markets can't raise the interest rates. It's the Treasury and the Federal Reserve working together, working in coordination, that controls those interest rates. So, if they don't want the cost of government debt to go up, then the cost of government debt won't go up. But if the cost of government debt does go up, then I'll tell you a secret. So what? Since we've already established the government can always pay its debts, if there are policy reasons to allow the cost of its debt to rise, then let the cost of its debt rise. The government's still going to be able to pay for it. That's not a problem. But of course, what they say, what the Austerians say is, the government won't be able to afford the cost of the government debt going up. When it goes up to where it was in the 1990s, like about 5%, or even higher than 5% as it was in the 1980s, there's going to be a disaster here. When the interest bill isn't $450 billion, but has risen to $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion, the United States is doomed. Nonsense. The capacity is always there to pay. And you know what? When the interest on that debt rises and the Federal Reserve makes profits on that interest, do you know what the Federal Reserve does with those profits? All but 6% of them, it pays back to the U.S. Treasury. It recycles around and comes back to the U.S. Treasury. That's the reality. That's what really happens in our government. So, the next myth, the next silly myth, the public debt is growing faster than the economy. This is a trend that cannot be sustained. There goes the unsustainability again. Okay. So, if the public debt is growing faster than the economy, then the remedy is to have enough deficit spending, even if it incurs a great deal more debt, to get the economy moving faster than the public debt is growing. We know this can be done because after World War II, it was done continuously. It was done continuously until it hit a low point under Nixon during the 1970s. And almost that same low point under Jimmy Carter a few years later. So we know that the debt as a percentage of the GDP, taken as a percentage of the GDP, which is the measurement these people use, we know that ratio of debt can grow more slowly than the economy if we'll stop allowing the economy to stagnate and have deficits large enough to always sustain full employment in our economy and entirely use our productive capacity, which will then grow each year due to rises in productivity that everyone will be sharing in the benefits of. That's how to make the public debt grow more slowly as a percentage than the economy. That's what you do if you want that to happen. You don't pull back on deficit spending. You get it to the level it needs to be to make that happen. If you want to look at World War II as an economic program, of course it wasn't mostly an economic program. It was a security program. But if you want to look at it, okay, as an economic program, I mean, that's what FDR did. He took a stagnant economy, which we entered the war with, largely stagnant economy, only slowly recovering from the Depression, and he goosed it with large amounts of public debt relative to the time, so that the debt to GDP ratio rose to something like 126%. That's what we came out of World War II with. And as I said, under Nixon, that debt to GDP ratio, reduced by many presidents over a number of years, was reduced to roughly 24% of GDP. So there was a 100% decrease in the debt to GDP ratio during those years. Why? Because the economy was growing faster than the debt. Why? Because from 1945 to 1970, the economy was largely growing steadily like gangbusters through those years. Even if you look at the 1970s, that is a period where growth in the economy is faster than it was in the 2000s. It is not a slow period in economic growth, not even in real economic growth, not even if we subtract the effects of the oil-induced inflation with the assistance of the Federal Reserve, as I explained in my last program. So, number one, though the public debt is growing faster than the economy right now, that's not a problem when it comes to sustaining our payments on the growing public debt for reasons that I mentioned earlier. But if you find it to be a problem and you don't like it, then for God's sake, make the economy grow faster than the debt. The means are there. Just vote in order to get it done. Don't sit there and wring your hands and say, the public debt is growing faster than the economy, so I got to cut back on all this excessive spending. If you want to do that, the economy is going to be in such a state that the public debt is going to grow ever faster than the economy. You'll be doing exactly the wrong thing, exactly the opposite thing that ought to be done. So then the next myth, they say, well, we can't keep adding debt to the national credit card. Okay. You have a credit card, and you can't keep adding debt to your credit card because the bank sets a limit to the credit that it's going to advance to you. But the federal government, with the consent of Congress, if Congress gets rid of the debt ceiling, can create a situation where we can keep adding debt to the national credit card. In fact, if you view money created by the federal government as debt, which in a profound sense it is, because high-powered money represents tax credits in the economy, which the federal government must honor in the future. Since that's the case, the very creation of money involves creation, of debt. And again, we've already gone over how the federal government can create whatever money it needs to create to pay its obligations. So that means that, strictly speaking, even without the debt ceiling, even just putting the debt ceiling aside and saying, to hell with it, I'm not even going to think about it, we do have a limitless national credit card. If we don't limit what we spend, of course, we could run into inflation and a lot of other nasty effects. I'm not saying no. But if you don't want us to add any more money to the economy, and you're upset by that and disturbed by it, then show that what we're spending now is too great in terms of overheating the economy. What? You can't show that because we still have a lot of idle productive capacity? No, if you can't show that, then it's too bad for you. Because we can keep adding debt to the national credit card until we've exhausted the productive capacity of the economy, which, by the way, will be growing each year anyway if we create a situation where the economy is producing up to its productive capacity. So, and again, more myths. High debt levels equals fewer jobs and lower wages. This is like high public debt levels supposedly equal fewer jobs and lower wages. Well, if the government uses its limitless national credit card to create the dollars necessary to employ everybody in a federal job guarantee program, then ipso facto, there's going to be more jobs. And since we pass such a program and peg it as a living wage, we'd have more jobs at higher wages rather than fewer jobs at lower wages. So, the high debt levels equals fewer jobs, okay, and lower wages is an equation that may apply in certain particular situations, but it doesn't apply generally. So where are the conditions of its applications in writing that equations? Well, the people who write that equation never say. They never say under what conditions high debt levels equals fewer jobs and lower wages. And of course, that's what they have to do. Otherwise, they're just spouting nonsense. Just another myth. So, the next myth. Delaying action on the national debt means it will be much more difficult to protect the Medicare and Social Security from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all beneficiaries. Well, if people believe this nonsense, then this self-fulfilling prophecy will certainly come true. But if people recognize it for the myth, okay, that it is, and at some time in the future, simply put in the automatic funding clause into legislation that I spoke of earlier, there will be no problem in protecting Social Security and Medicare from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all beneficiaries. No problem at all. So, that's a piece of nonsense that you can talk against also. And then there's a related piece of nonsense, a related myth. If we do not address the debt now, federal investments in education, infrastructure, and research will decline. Again, if you listen to these people, yeah, these are going to decline, just like Trump is running around right now cutting all kinds of necessary things, including education, infrastructure, and research. But why is he doing that? It's not because Trump actually believes we cannot print the money. He said enough in the campaign for us to know that he knows we can print the money. He knows we don't have to go through these widespread cuts. So why is he going through the widespread cuts? Because the Republicans wanted the widespread cuts so they could keep alive the myth of the government running out of money. And so they could get these enormous tax cuts for their cronies, for the extremely wealthy people, the 0.0001% who support them, and the corporations, the wealthy corporations that support them very generously in campaigns, and that pay the bills of a lot of them, very handsomely, I might add, in the millions of dollars, when these people retire from Congress to lobby groups in the D.C. area. And don't think they don't know that's awaiting them in case we get angry and throw them out. They do know that awaits them. And they hope to serve the rich sufficiently well that they get such a reward after years of faithful service in Congress at the miserly salaries offered them by the public. They want their chance to feast on $1 million to $1.5 million per year in the lobbying sector here in Washington. So, we don't have to address the debt now if we don't want to. Of course, if we want to, we can always pay it off as it falls due with the proceeds from platinum coins. Or we can always pay it off by reorganizing the Federal Reserve under the Treasury and just have the Treasury Secretary order the Chairman of the Federal Reserve to pay off all the debt instruments whenever they fall due, automatically. Would that be neat? And then it wouldn't matter what our debts are anymore. In fact, our debts would be steadily declining. Well, what would happen to the private sector if they didn't have these treasury instruments, these debt instruments? Well, it's simple. The Federal Reserve can always pay interest on the reserves that they hold in banks. So they can still have a safe place to put their money and earn a return on it. That interest rate might not be as high as the interest rates paid by the Treasury right now, as low as they currently are. But still, they'd still get something back just because they had their money sitting there. Wouldn't you like that kind of deal? Anyway, our next myth. Taking steps to address our deficit now would mean a more robust economy and significant job growth over the next 10 years. Yes, it would mean a more robust economy and significant job growth over the next 10 years. So let's take the following steps to address our deficit. Let's increase the deficit to the amount it needs to be increased to get full potential out of our economy, to lift our economy, and get full employment for everybody at a living wage. And let's enhance our social safety nets. We pay about 1/2 what the Europeans pay to people who have a retirement pension. Why don't we get that Social Security doubled? Why don't we get the student debts listed? Why don't we make college education at all levels, through graduate school, free in public institutions? Do those things. Get the infrastructure. Get $4.6 trillion now in infrastructure reinvention done over 6 years. Those are the things that need to get done. If that results in more deficits, so what? The federal government can handle the deficits. That's not a problem. That's what would mean a more robust economy and significant job growth over the next 2 years. Yeah, there'd be fantastic job growth because the federal government has the power to create it with federal programs. It has the power to get the economy booming through its contributions to that economy. More myths about the burden of federal debt. More fiscal myths. You always hear, our grandchildren must have the heavy burden of paying off our national debt. Well, if we don't reform the stupid system we have now, and if they're stupid enough to decide to pay it off using that system, then they might indeed have the heavy burden, okay, of paying it off. But if they're smart enough to reorganize the Federal Reserve so it's sitting under the Treasury and it pays the debt instruments off as they fall due automatically, then they won't have any burden at all, because the Federal Reserve can just mark up the federal spending account so all those payoffs can occur. That's all that has to be done. And if we don't want to put the Federal Reserve under the Treasury, why we wouldn't has always been a terrible puzzle to me, because the Federal Reserve isn't really independent. That's a fiction anyway. I don't want to maintain that fiction any longer. I want to put the accountability where it belongs, in the executive branch of government, and have the Fed there. But if we can't get that done, and if our grandchildren can't get that done, then as long as everybody is careful to maintain that 1996 law and not allow anybody to repeal it, then our grandchildren can have recourse to platinum coins to get the necessary funds into Treasury's account to pay off the debt instruments whenever they fall due, and to cease issuing any more debt instruments. So, there's no need for our grandchildren to have a heavy burden. The whole thing can be effortless. But these people, these Austerians, want us all to believe that it can't be effortless, that it has to be a burden. Because after all, federal money's only created by taxing and borrowing, don't you know? How did the people with the money who were getting taxed and the people with the money who were buying the debt instruments get that money in the first place, if not from the federal government? Well, one way they got it was to go into debt themselves, with banks creating temporary money which gets extinguished when the debt is paid back. But another way they got it is by getting high-powered money that was created by the federal government itself. They are literally giving back the federal government its own money, or the money that it had originally created. Well, if it originally created that, why can't it create more? Of course, it can create more. But they don't want people to think through this whole chain. Where did it come from? Did the stork bring it? Okay. The true burden of the debt is the interest cost. Well, Bruce Bartlett, who's a very reasonable guy, and who used to be in the Reagan administration, but over the years has gotten closer and closer to where Jamie Galbraith stands, and who's become a pretty progressive guy, disgusted with the Republican Party, whom he refers to as wankers, okay, using that wonderful British term, these wankers. He says the true burden of the debt is the interest cost. Well, as much as I hated to do it, I had to correct him. No, it's not the interest cost, because the interest cost is no more a burden to the federal government than any other cost, because the federal government is a currency and reserve and coin-creating government in whatever quantities it wants to create those things. So, that's not the true burden of the debt. There is no true burden of the debt. There is no burden of the debt. And poor Ryan, here's poor Ryan. We face a crushing burden of debt. The debt will soon eclipse our entire economy. and grow to catastrophic levels in the years ahead. Uh, okay. So, so, uh, Paul Ryan is Mr. Mythologist himself. How did he get to be that? Well, first he followed Ayn Rand. Then he got connected up to the Koch brothers and the Petersons. And now he makes them all happy by telling everybody the fairy tale about how we face a crushing burden of debt that will soon eclipse our entire economy and grow to catastrophic levels in the years ahead. I should only have the power to pay off the debt that the federal government has, or that poor Ryan has, if he wasn't such a villain. Anyway, they also say, in relation to the burden of federal debt, they also advance the myth, the next generation will inherit a stagnant economy and a diminished country. Well, it certainly will in response to the policies they've been following. Cutting the deficit, cutting the deficit, cutting the deficit. Ever look at Paul Ryan's budgets? Smaller and smaller deficits until they zero out. He wants a zero amount. While we have trade deficits of 3 and 4 and 5 and 6%. He wants to zero out the budget deficits. Why does he want to do that? So that the not so rich people in the private sector get poorer and poorer and poorer, and his friends get richer and richer and richer. And how do they benefit from that? Well, they're in a better position to establish the hereditary aristocracy that people like them have wanted to do since the time of the revolution in 1776. That's what these people want. That's what these people are about. They believe in oligarchy and hereditary aristocracy. They despise the American experiment. They despise us. They despise everyone who are not among their cronies. Maybe they despise themselves for all I know. I don't know. If you've ever seen that Eddie Murphy and what's his name, the movie about stock market trading, okay, and the Duke brothers, okay, I'm sure the Duke brothers were modeled on the Kochs. I mean, the Kochs had to have been the model for those two guys. Okay, we believe the days of business as usual must come to an end. We hold to a couple of simple convictions. This is Paul Ryan again, by the way. Endless borrowing is not a strategy. Spending cuts have to come first. Well, you know, I don't really necessarily favor these. Yeah, trading places, right. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Rocco. Trading places, right. The next generation, endless borrowing is not a strategy. Spending cuts have to come first. Well, I don't favor what their alternatives to spending cuts would be, because I just want to get some benefits to people. I want to end that suffering. I want to improve the lot, okay, of most people. And for my money, the big fellas can go hang if they want. But of course, under their economics, the obvious alternative is not that spending cuts should come first. It's that we need to get back to the levels of taxation and inheritance taxes that we had in the 1950s. But no, they don't want us to think about that alternative. They don't want us to think about that alternative. Well, let me tell you, if they're unwilling to accept getting benefit programs for people and selling debt instruments to do it, or minting platinum coins to do it, or doing the other things that we could do to get that actually done, then we ought to offer them those taxation rates instead. We ought to say, we'll make you a deal. If you forget about this spending cut nonsense, we'll forget about what happened under Roosevelt, under Truman, under Eisenhower. We'll forget about that. But if you won't, then we're not going to forget about that. Next. More myths about the burden of federal debt. They say profoundly, delaying action on the national debt means it will be much more difficult to protect Social Security and Medicare from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all the beneficiaries. Well, we covered this already. It's just as easy to protect those. Just write in the automatic little thing in the legislation, the automatic funding in 2 or 3 lines in the legislation. I don't even know if it's 2 or 3 lines. I mean, I forget. I know what the clause actually says because it appeared in the blog by Stephanie Kelton. Okay. But it might be 5 or 6 words. It might be a sentence. Okay. But that's all that needs to be done to protect Medicare and Social Security from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all beneficiaries. That and preventing these guys from getting any more control of Congress. We got to get them out. We got to get them out. We got to get all their Democratic fellow travelers out. And there are many of those fellow travelers. Many of them. Too many of them. They all need to be primaried and out. Okay, they talk about foreign-held government debt representing special solvency problems. But they never explain why the foreign debt represents special solvency problems. When we talk to them about the Japanese case, where the Japanese kept on running up their debts until I think now there's something like, last I looked, 250%, okay, of GDP, okay, is their ratio. And Japan is, oh, I'd say as sound as the dollar, but really they're as sound as the yen. In other words, their currency, their solvency is absolutely solid in spite of a debt to GDP ratio, okay, as large as that. Okay, but they say, oh, that's because there's not much foreign debt. That's because Japan sells all their debt instruments to their patriotic population and not to these foreigners, whereas we sell ours to the Japanese themselves, to the Chinese, to the Saudis, to everyone under the sun, And that presents special solvency problems for us. Oh, yeah? Why? All that debt is in the US dollars that we can manufacture using our capacity to produce high-powered money. So what's the deal? What's the problem? Why does it present special solvency problems? And now we come to myths, fiscal myths about the government, family, or the government household. They say the government is just like a family, even though it's a very big one. And like any family, it has a household budget called the government budget. The federal government is like a household, and since households sacrifice to live within their financial means, government ought to do that too. And they say every man, woman, and child in the United States now owes more than $50,000 to pay off the national debt. So they try to put that debt on every one of us. But as I said in a recent broadcast, I did look a few videos ago, or 2 months ago, I guess. You didn't contract any of that debt. And you're not responsible for that debt. You're not responsible for a penny of it unless Congress makes you responsible by taxing you to pay it off. So fight Congress about that. Stop them from doing it. Because there's no need to tax you to pay it off. It can be paid off as it falls due by either issuing more debt or by minting platinum coins and using them to pay off the debt, or by reorganizing the Fed into the Treasury Department and having the Treasury Department simply create the funds in its spending account to pay off that debt as it falls due. These are the things that we must make our government do so they don't make us responsible for $50,000 or $60,000 a person, which they seem to be fixing to do. They seem to be fixing to cut all the taxes on the rich while leaving our taxes the same, and maybe raising them a little bit in hidden ways. If they get away with that, it won't be too long until they come after us for that 50 or 60,000, arguing that all the money of our rich people is offshore and they can't touch it. Good, it's offshore, it's out of our economy, it's of no concern to us. Let's just replace it with money that we freshly create here. Then they can go spend that overseas if they want. Or they can just sit on it and let it run through their fingers. Okay, then there are myths about spending too much, inflation and hyperinflation. They say the only way to reduce the deficit is to cut excessive spending wherever we find it. In domestic spending, in defense spending, in healthcare spending, and spending through tax breaks and loopholes. And they say this is the real world with real choices and real consequences. Significant deficits must be closed. And we also have significant needs to grow and complete compete in the 21st century competitive, technologically integrated international economy. Yes, folks, we have significant needs to grow, and we do have to compete in the 21st century competitive, technologically integrated international economy. But the way we need to do that is to support growth and research and education here. For reasons already mentioned, there's no reason to close all the deficits. What we need to do is increase the deficits so that they the budget deficits, so that they compensate for demand leakage to savers and to imports from the foreign sector. We always must take care to see that we're using our full productive potential, that everybody is employed, that everybody is working. And we need to spend to make that happen. And if these folks don't like the increasing debts that go along with the increasing deficits, then let them come forward and support the proposals to use platinum coins, or the proposals to put the Federal Reserve inside the Treasury. Let them do that if the debt bothers them so much. The debt is really no problem for the federal government to handle. They are making it a problem. They have made it a political problem. So, if they continue to make it a political problem, what we ought to do is to present to them a political solution, like the platinum coin solution, or the reorganizing Treasury solution, putting the Federal Reserve under the Treasury. Those are political solutions to the political problem that they present to us. If they don't want to believe that it isn't a political problem, that it's a real financial problem, then too bad for them. That's a myth. These problems are only political problems. They do not reflect actual solvency problems. So they also say, if we spend enough to get to full employment, then we will have inflation and risk hyperinflation. Well, I say that's fine with me, because the cure for inflation or hyperinflation is higher taxes. And we should take care that those higher taxes are eventually levied on them, so that we reduce the inequality that is so dangerous to democracy that exists in our society. That ought to be only a last resort. But we should continue to keep it in view. Continue to discuss whether it's necessary to contain inflation or whether it's not necessary to contain inflation. But never let them advocate without challenge that to contain inflation, we want to cut spending. No, we don't. To contain inflation, we want to do what's more in the public purpose, and that is to lessen inequality here by taxing them. And then finally they'll scream, "You're talking Weimar, you're talking Zimbabwe. Hyperinflation is always a substantial risk if the government prints money." Print, quote, unquote. Weimar and Zimbabwe were situations much different from where the United States is today. The productive capacity of the Weimar Republic had been partially destroyed and partially taken away from it by the World War I peace agreements. And the debts in hard currency, in gold, and in harder foreign currency that Weimar had to use to repay those debts. And when they printed German marks in order to repay those debts, of course, they were discounted at the international level. The more they printed, the more they were discounted. That's what caused the hyperinflation in Germany. That, and also that the labor unions were strong and were trying to keep pace with the rises in inflation, whose root cause was basically the peace agreements, the World War I peace agreements that were so unjust to Germany. So, that was the case in Weimar Germany. In Zimbabwe, well, the government destroyed the productive capacity of the economy. It destroyed the agricultural productivity of the economy by kicking the Boers off the land and giving ownership of the very productive farms to people who didn't know how to run them. So there were food shortages and there were foreign exchange shortages, which the government had to try to compensate for by printing money. And of course it failed, and it led to a hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. But we don't have a situation anywhere close to this in the United States. Our productive capacity is still largely intact in spite of the economic stagnation we've experienced for probably more than a decade now. And our skill sets are still pretty intact also. Our economic capacity is intact. We're lacking the financial inputs which the federal government would be able to provide. So our problem is to get those financial inputs. It's not to run around like frightened children screaming Weimar, Zimbabwe, or any other cases that have no connection to the monetarily sovereign United States that can create its currency in order to cause the full productive capacity of the economy to be reached. So where are we? Well, we're almost very close to our time now, thanks to the little glitch we had earlier, interrupting the broadcast. There are still other myths to cover. There are government austerity and shared sacrifice myths. There are myths about our economic future. There are myths about money, lots of myths about money. And there are myths about fiscal responsibility. All these remain to be discussed, but they will have to wait for a future program. So, have you any questions now that you would like me to answer. Russell says, how many myths were you wanting to cover? Well, I listed the myths, Russell, but I didn't really count them. So I'm not sure. I just listed them. I knew the categories of myths I had covered and the categories of myths that I hadn't covered. And isn't that Zimbabwean dictator still in power? I have to admit that lately I have not looked, but that yes, Mugabe could still be in power, for all I know. He may have managed to survive the whole travesty there. Well, thank you, Don. Barbara, I'm sorry. Thank you, Barbara, too. And thank you, Don, as well. Okay, any other questions? Any questions about government solvency? Well, Rocco, you missed something in the first half when I started off the program, but we then had a power glitch. I must have lost power about 8:15, and I don't think I was able to restore the broadcast until 8:35 or so. What I had to do was actually stream a new broadcast because the old broadcast could not be recovered. But it was easy enough to stream a new broadcast once I got my power back. Thank you, Russell. I will enjoy the rest of my evening. Okay, any other questions? Mark says, I can't wait for that armored truck. Let's see this one. Yes, that's a good one. And Rocco said, we can pay the unemployed to learn technical or highly needed jobs on the job with the private sector. We can do that to some degree. Yes, not Weimar and not Zimbabwe. Yes, Don. Hyperinflation, hyperventilators. I'm not sure whether to thank Bill Mitchell for that or Rob Parenteau. I forgot who originated hyperinflation, hyperventilators, but I think it was one of those two folks. So Jesse asks, public sector or private, working for the state or contracting private industry, does it matter? If so, why? I think it's not so much the difference between public sector or private sector, but the difference between those enterprises that are looking to produce value for the market as opposed to those enterprises that are looking to produce social value. There may be many non-government sector organizations primarily devoted to producing social value that can work with the job guarantee program to provide projects for job guarantee workers to work on, and those workers would be directly paid by the federal government, but would be working on these non-government sector projects, the projects devoted to social value rather than devoted to market value. Because as we look at our economy now, we see so many areas of social value which go unmet because the market economy finds them not profitable enough in money terms, so that it cannot fill the social needs that we know have to be filled. And that we know that people can think up if they're given a chance to think them up. They are real needs, but we have to open our minds to what they are. We have to recognize that every day we're conditioned by market value needs. And we don't think about social needs anymore because there are very few jobs in the social value sector. Job guarantee programs will open up jobs in the social value sector. And then we will learn to think in terms of such jobs and what they might entail. So, okay, it's now 10 o'clock. So I am going to say goodnight and to wish you a very nice evening. And I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for hanging in there in spite of the power glitch. And I want to thank you for your active commentary throughout our two broadcasts tonight. Mark Fabian said, this is one last question which I might want to post up there. It's a final thing. Let's see, what did he say? People tell me the government doesn't determine the value of the dollar. Forex traders do. Can you give me a good response? Well, the Forex traders certainly influence the value of the dollar on foreign exchanges for purposes of foreign trade. But our foreign trade is still a fairly small percentage, okay, of the economy. Our trade deficits are a fairly small percentage, okay, of GDP. So basically, we are not in the Zimbabwe position. We're in a position where the value of our dollar is mostly determined by the combination of our Federal Reserve and our federal government here. The federal government, including the Federal Reserve, hold a monopoly position with respect to the issuance of our currency, okay, and our reserves. And the price that the federal government is willing to pay for goods and services percolates down through the whole economy, even into the foreign sector, and is much more influential than any other factor in determining the value, okay, of our money. We are not like those nations that are completely responsible to the whims of the foreign exchange traders. We're just not. And that's a fact. So I hope that's a good response. I hope it's sufficiently clear. I do think that whether sufficiently clear or not, it is the right answer to that question. So again, good night, and thank you for coming. And I'll see you next Saturday, not necessarily with more myths. I may switch to another subject for a while before then. Anyway, good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.